Tio with raven bnoi dung twin thun with circumflexem ton trong mot hoi van ban duet. Not the night after that dinner. I did not sleep. I sat at the small oak desk in the guest bedroom, the same desk my late husband bought from a hardware store in Des Moines back in 1987, and I replayed every word my daughter-in-law had spoken with that polite smile that never reached her eyes. For months I had ignored the small signs. The way she corrected me in front of friends. The way she gently suggested that I simplify my finances because managing a 2,000 square foot home was too much at your age. I had told myself she was being helpful. That is what mothers do. We excuse what hurts us. But that evening at the restaurant, when she announced they were restructuring the house ownership and my name would be removed for tax efficiency, I understood something clearly for the first time. This was never about helping me. This was about positioning me. The next morning, I poured my coffee into the blue ceramic mug that says World's Best Grandma, and instead of calling my son like I usually did, I called Mr. Henderson, the attorney who handled my husband's will 12 years ago. My voice did not shake. I asked for an appointment. I did not tell anyone. Not my son. Not her. I drove myself downtown in my silver Toyota, the one with 112,000 miles on it, and I walked into that office wearing my pearl necklace and my navy cardigan like armor. Mr. Henderson listened carefully as I explained the paperwork my daughter-in-law had placed in front of me 2 weeks earlier, the document I had not signed because I wanted to think about it. He adjusted his glasses and said gently, "You are wise to wait." Wise. I had not felt wise in months. I had felt old. Slow. Replaceable. But in that moment, I remembered who I was before anyone called me a burden. I was the woman who worked double shifts to put my son through college. I was the woman who paid off this house 10 years early. I was not confused. I was not fragile. And I was certainly not ready to be erased. When I returned home that afternoon, my daughter-in-law was at the kitchen counter measuring ingredients for one of her gluten-free recipes. She looked up and asked if I had thought about the documents. I smiled the same soft smile she always used on me. I told her I had scheduled a financial review because at my age, as she often reminded me, one must be careful. I saw it then, the flicker in her eyes, not anger, not yet, but calculation. She had assumed I would sign. She had assumed gratitude would make me obedient. What she did not know was that I had already begun rearranging more than paperwork. I had begun rearranging power. And this time, I would not announce it over dinner. 2 days later, the house felt different, as if the walls themselves were listening. My daughter-in-law moved through the kitchen with extra sweetness, offering to organize my medication drawer, asking whether I needed help scheduling my annual physical, reminding me that winter was coming and perhaps a senior living community would be safer. Each word was wrapped in concern, but underneath it I could hear urgency. She needed my signature. She needed control before I had time to think. What she did not know was that I had already thought about everything. That afternoon I returned to Mr. Henderson's office with a folder I had kept locked in the bottom drawer of my dresser for over a decade. Inside were the original deed to the house, the life insurance policy from my husband, and the small investment account I had quietly built from years of tutoring neighborhood children in mathematics for $25 an hour. It was never about the money. It was about dignity. Mr. Henderson explained my options carefully. The house was solely in my name. There was no legal requirement to restructure anything. If I wished, I could place the property into a trust with clear conditions. Conditions. That word settled into my spirit like a steady heartbeat. By the time I drove home, I had made a decision. That evening my son came home from work looking tired, his tie loosened, his shoulders slumped. He kissed my cheek and asked if everything was all right. I studied his face, the same brown eyes he had as a little boy when he asked for help with his homework at the kitchen table. I realized something. Painful but necessary. He was not leading this plan. He was following it. After dinner, my daughter-in-law brought the documents out again, placing them neatly beside my plate. She spoke gently about long-term planning and simplifying assets. I folded my napkin and looked at both of them. I told them I had met with my attorney. The room went quiet. I explained that I would not be signing anything. Instead, I would be creating a family trust that ensured the house would remain secure during my lifetime and distributed according to my wishes afterward. My daughter-in-law blinked quickly, her smile tightening. She asked whether I trusted her. I answered calmly that trust is not proven by pressure. My son shifted uncomfortably, asking why this was necessary. I told him that clarity protects relationships. If there is nothing to hide, there is nothing to rush. For the first time since that dinner at the restaurant, I felt steady. I was not raising my voice. I was not accusing anyone. I was simply drawing a line around my own life. And as I watched the careful expressions on their faces, I understood that the quiet woman they had been preparing to sideline was no longer available for that role. The following week unfolded with a quiet tension that settled into every corner of the house. My daughter-in-law stopped offering to organize my drawers. She stopped mentioning senior communities. Instead, she began speaking in careful phrases, as if every sentence needed approval before leaving her mouth. My son avoided long conversations altogether. He stayed later at the office and spent more time scrolling through his phone at the dinner table. I watched them both the way a woman watches storm clouds gather over an open field. You cannot stop the weather, but you can prepare your home. 3 days after our conversation, an email arrived addressed to my son and copied to me. It was from a real estate agent, recommending a market evaluation for the property, suggesting that given current conditions, selling might be advantageous. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I printed the email and placed it in my folder beside the trust documents Mr. Henderson had drafted. That afternoon, I invited my son to sit with me on the back porch. The air was crisp, just under 55 degrees, the maple tree in the yard beginning to turn gold. I asked him directly whether he had contacted the agent. He hesitated, then admitted that he and his wife had been exploring options in case we all decided to relocate. We all. The phrase felt rehearsed. I told him calmly that exploration without conversation feels like exclusion. He rubbed his forehead and said they were only trying to plan for the future. I nodded and told him I was planning as well. I explained that the trust would include a residency clause. As long as I was alive and mentally capable, no sale could occur without my written consent. Furthermore, any attempt to pressure or misrepresent information regarding my property would result in immediate revocation of shared living privileges. He looked at me with surprise, not because I was harsh, but because I was precise. That evening my daughter-in-law confronted me in the kitchen, her voice still polite but edged with frustration. She said I was making them feel unwelcome in their own home. I set down the dish towel and reminded her gently that the deed carried only one name. I told her I had opened my home out of love, not obligation. Love does not require surrender. For a long moment she said nothing. The silence between us was no longer filled with pretense. It was filled with awareness. They had believed that age meant weakness, that gratitude meant compliance. What they were beginning to understand was that patience is not the same as passivity. I had given my family everything willingly, but I would not give away my foundation simply to keep the peace. And as I turned off the kitchen lights that night, I felt something I had not felt in months. Not anger, not fear. Authority. By the end of that month, the atmosphere inside the house had shifted from subtle maneuvering to quiet distance. My daughter-in-law no longer tried to persuade me with gentle words. Instead, she began excluding me from small family decisions. Weekend plans were discussed in low voices. Grocery lists were rewritten without asking what I might need. It was a quiet strategy, designed to make me feel peripheral in a home I had paid off with 30 years of mortgage payments. I recognized it immediately because I had once used a similar silence myself when my son was a stubborn teenager. Silence can be a tool. The difference was that I had used it to teach responsibility. They were using it to create discomfort. One Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen to find brochures spread across the counter. They were for newly built townhouses about 15 miles away, each one advertised as modern, efficient, and low maintenance. My daughter-in-law quickly gathered the papers, but not before I noticed the handwritten notes in the margins discussing sale projections for my current property. That afternoon, instead of reacting emotionally, I made another appointment with Mr. Henderson. This time, I instructed him to finalize the trust immediately and to add a formal occupancy agreement. The agreement would state clearly that any adult residing in my home contributed a fair market rent based on local rates, approximately $1,200 per month for comparable properties in our area, along with a shared utility percentage. It was not about the money. It was about resetting assumptions. When I presented the finalized documents at dinner 2 nights later, I spoke calmly and evenly. I explained that since we were discussing financial clarity, it was only fair that everyone understand their responsibilities. My son stared at the numbers, clearly calculating. My daughter-in-law's expression tightened. She asked whether I truly intended to charge my own child rent. I answered that adults contribute where they live. I reminded them that I had never asked for $1 in the 2 years they had stayed with me. I had done so out of love while they saved for their future. But if the future now involved planning around my removal, then our arrangement needed boundaries. My son attempted to reassure me that no one was trying to remove me. I looked at him gently and said that trust is demonstrated through actions, not reassurances. If they believed the house was a shared asset, then shared responsibility should not be offensive. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence belonged to me. I was no longer reacting to their strategies. I was establishing my own. And as I cleared the dishes that evening, I realized something profound. They had expected resistance to look emotional. They had prepared for tears. What they were facing instead was structure. And structure does not argue. It simply stands. The next payment was due on the 1st of the month. I did not remind them. I did not leave notes on the refrigerator or send polite text messages. I simply waited. On the evening of the 1st, I checked the envelope slot on my desk. It was empty. The following morning at breakfast, I poured my coffee and asked in a calm voice whether there had been a delay at the bank. My son looked confused for a moment, then remembered. My daughter-in-law quickly explained that they had assumed I would reconsider, that perhaps the agreement had only been symbolic. I folded my hands on the table and said gently that written agreements are not decorations. They are commitments. The air felt heavier than usual, but I did not raise my voice. I explained that the occupancy agreement was now active and payment was expected within 5 business days, just as any landlord would require. My son's jaw tightened slightly. He asked whether I was truly prepared to treat family like tenants. I answered that I was prepared to treat adults like adults. Love does not cancel accountability. Over the next 3 days, the atmosphere shifted again. This time it was not exclusion. It was discomfort. Doors closed more firmly. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. But something else happened as well. I noticed my son studying the monthly household expenses I had printed and left on the kitchen counter. Mortgage 0. Property taxes clearly listed. Utilities itemized. Insurance detailed. For the first time, he was seeing the structure that had protected him his entire life. On the 4th day, an envelope appeared on my desk. Inside was a cashier's check for the full amount. No note. No apology. Just payment. I held it for a moment, not with triumph, but with clarity. This was not about collecting $1,200. It was about correcting a narrative that had quietly formed around me. The narrative that I was dependent. That I was lucky to have them. That my role was to accommodate and adjust. That evening, my daughter-in-law approached me in the living room. She said the arrangement felt transactional and cold. I listened without interruption. Then I told her that security often feels cold to those who benefited from warmth without responsibility. I reminded her that I had opened my home generously. I had cooked meals, watched their child when needed, covered repairs without complaint. But generosity without boundaries invites entitlement. I was not withdrawing love. I was defining terms. Later that night, as I locked the front door and turned off the porch light, I felt an unfamiliar steadiness settle in my chest. They had expected resistance to collapse under pressure. Instead, it had solidified. And in that quiet hallway, beneath the framed photographs of birthdays and graduations, I understood something with certainty. Respect, once re-established, changes the temperature of an entire house. By the middle of the second month, the payments continued, always on time, always exact. The cashier's checks were placed quietly on my desk, as if acknowledging a rule no one wanted to discuss out loud. The tension in the house no longer felt sharp. It felt measured. My son had begun asking practical questions about property taxes and maintenance costs. He asked how much the new roof had been 5 years ago and what the annual insurance premium covered. I answered every question calmly, even pulling out old folders with receipts and warranties. For the first time, he was not speaking as a child who assumed stability. He was speaking as a man realizing what stability costs. My daughter-in-law remained courteous, but distant. She stopped referring to the house as our place and instead used phrases like, your home. It was subtle, but words reveal shifts in understanding. One Sunday afternoon, she invited me to sit with her at the dining table. She said she felt the arrangement had created emotional space between us. I listened carefully. She admitted that when they first moved in 2 years ago, they had assumed the house would eventually become theirs. Not because I had promised it, but because it felt inevitable. I nodded slowly. Assumptions often feel like promises to the person making them. I told her that inheritance is a gift, not a strategy. It is something given freely, not secured through positioning. She looked down at her hands and said she had worried about their financial future. I understood that fear. I had lived it when my husband passed away, and I faced the mortgage alone. But fear does not justify control. I explained that I had updated the trust not to punish them, but to protect clarity. The home would be distributed fairly one day, but not under pressure and not as a reward for maneuvering. Later that week, my son approached me in the garage while I was organizing old storage boxes. He said quietly that he had not realized how their behavior might have felt. He admitted that he allowed conversations to move forward without fully considering my position. I appreciated the honesty more than an apology. Growth rarely begins with dramatic gestures. It begins with awareness. That evening, the house felt different again. Not tense. Not transactional. Just honest. I understood that authority had reshaped the dynamic, but something else was happening beneath it. Responsibility was reshaping them. And as I closed the garage door and walked back into the kitchen, I recognized that the greatest shift was not the rent payments or the signed documents. It was the quiet acknowledgement that I was not an obstacle in their future. I was the foundation they had misunderstood. And foundations do not disappear simply because someone grows impatient. Autumn settled fully over the neighborhood, and with it came a quieter rhythm inside the house. The maple tree in the backyard had turned a deep amber, and every Saturday morning I raked the leaves into neat piles along the fence. This time, my son joined me without being asked. He worked steadily beside me, pushing the rake across the lawn in long strokes, occasionally glancing toward the house, as if measuring more than just the yard. Responsibility had begun to show in small, practical ways. The rent payments were no longer silent envelopes. He now handed them to me directly, sometimes adding a brief update about their savings account or their plans to eventually purchase a home of their own. It was not performative. It was measured. My daughter-in-law also shifted her approach. She no longer spoke about market evaluations or relocation strategies. Instead, she asked me one evening whether I would be willing to review their budget with them. The request was simple, but it carried humility. We sat at the dining table with a yellow legal pad, and I walked them through line-by-line expenses, explaining how I had once allocated every dollar when money was tight after my husband passed. I showed them how small adjustments, even $100 a month, accumulate over time. There was no tension in the room, only focus. I realized then that boundaries had not fractured the family. They had clarified it. A week later, my daughter-in-law surprised me by preparing dinner and setting the table formally, using the good plates I had stored in the cabinet for special occasions. She thanked me for insisting on structure. She admitted that without it, they might have continued believing that security simply existed, rather than being built. I listened without gloating. Authority does not need applause. What mattered was the change in tone. They were no longer maneuvering around me. They were learning beside me. That evening, after they went upstairs, I walked through the quiet living room and paused by the framed photographs along the hallway. There we were at graduations, birthdays, Christmas mornings. I understood something deeper than control or property. What I had defended was not just a house measured in square feet. It was the principle that age does not equal irrelevance. Experience does not expire. The following Sunday, my son told me they had started viewing modest starter homes within their price range, not as an escape plan, but as a goal they would reach responsibly. I nodded and told him I would support them when they were ready, not by surrendering my foundation, but by cheering their growth. As I turned off the porch light that night and looked out at the quiet street, I felt no need to assert authority anymore. It was already understood. Respect had returned not through conflict, but through consistency. And inside that steady house, beneath a roof I had protected for decades, something even stronger had taken root. Mutual understanding. Winter arrived earlier than expected that year, and the first frost settled across the lawn like a quiet reminder that seasons change whether we are ready or not. Inside the house, the rhythm we had rebuilt continued to strengthen. My son and his wife had been consistent with their payments, but more importantly, they had been consistent with their effort. I noticed it in the way they discussed long-term plans openly at the dinner table, no longer in hushed conversations behind closed doors. One evening, my son brought home a folder filled with printed listings of modest homes within a 30-mile radius, all within a realistic price range based on the budget we had reviewed together. He did not present them as an escape. He presented them as a milestone. That difference mattered. My daughter-in-law asked if I would be willing to attend an open house with them the following weekend, not to evaluate the decor, but to help them assess structural details and resale potential. I agreed. Walking through those properties, I remained observant but neutral. I pointed out practical concerns, such as the age of the furnace, the slope of the driveway during icy months, and the property tax history in each neighborhood. I spoke from experience, not control. They listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions with genuine curiosity rather than hidden intention. On the drive home, my daughter-in-law thanked me for not dismissing their plans and for not holding the house over their heads as leverage. I told her calmly that leverage creates fear, not loyalty. What I had wanted all along was mutual respect. Later that week, my son approached me with a question that surprised me. He asked whether I would consider remaining in the house alone once they moved, or if I had thought about downsizing on my own terms someday. It was not framed as urgency. It was framed as concern for my comfort. I appreciated the difference. I explained that I was content for now, that the 2,000 square feet did not overwhelm me, and that I would make future decisions when I felt ready, not when pressured. He nodded without argument. That simple acceptance spoke louder than any apology could have. As December approached, the house filled with familiar holiday decorations. This time, we decorated together without tension. My daughter-in-law carefully unwrapped the glass ornaments I had collected over 40 years, asking about the story behind each one. My son repaired a loose hinge on the front door without being asked. The house no longer felt like contested ground. It felt like shared space with clearly defined boundaries. And as I stood by the living room window watching snow begin to fall under the porch light, I understood something profound. Authority had restored balance, but consistency had restored trust. What began as a quiet attempt to reposition me had transformed into a lesson none of us expected. Respect, once demanded with calm clarity, had grown into something stronger than control. It had grown into maturity.